Supernatural Horror in Literature by H.P. Lovecraft. Chapter 10. The Modern Masters. The best horror tales of today, profiting by the long evolution of the type, possess a naturalness, convincingness, artistic smoothness, and skilful intensity of appeal quite beyond comparison with anything in the Gothic work of a century or more ago. Technique, craftsmanship, experience, and psychological knowledge have advanced tremendously with the passing years, so that much of the older work seems naive and artificial, redeemed, when redeemed at all, only by a genius which conquers heavy limitations. The tone of jaunty and inflated romance, full of false motivation and investing every conceivable event with a counterfeit significance and carelessly inclusive glamour, is now confined to lighter and more whimsical phases of supernatural writing. Serious weird stories are either made realistically intense by close consistency and perfect fidelity to nature, except in the one supernatural direction which the author allows himself, or else cast altogether in the realm of fantasy, with atmosphere cunningly adapted to the visualization of a delicately exotic world of unreality beyond space and time, in which almost anything may happen, if it but happen in true accord with certain types of imagination and illusion normal to the sensitive human brain. This, at least, is the dominant tendency, though of course many great contemporary writers slip occasionally into some of the flashy postures of immature romanticism, or into bits of the equally empty and absurd jargon of pseudo-scientific occultism, now at one of its periodic high tides. Of living creators of cosmic fear, raised to its most artistic pitch, few, if any, can hope to equal the versatile Arthur Machen, author of some dozen tales long and short, in which the elements of hidden horror and brooding fright attain an almost incomparable substance and realistic acuteness. Mr. Machen, a general man of letters and master of an exquisitely lyrical and expressive prose style, has perhaps put more conscious effort into his picaresque Chronicles of Clemendy, his refreshing essays, his vivid autobiographical volumes, his fresh and spirited translations, and above all his memorable epic of the sensitive aesthetic mind, The Hill of Dreams, in which the youthful hero responds to the magic of that ancient Welsh environment which is the author's own, and lives a dream life in the Roman city of Isca Salurum, now shrunk to the relic-strewn village of Caerleon on Usk. But the fact remains that his powerful horror material of the 90s and earlier 1900s stands alone in its class, and marks a distinct epoch in the history of this literary form. Mr. Machen, with his impressionable Celtic heritage, linked to keen youthful memories of the wild domed hills, archaic forests, and cryptical Roman ruins of the Gwent countryside, has developed an imaginative life of rare beauty, intensity, and historic background. He has absorbed the medieval mystery of dark woods and ancient customs, and is a champion of the Middle Ages in all things, including the Catholic faith. He has yielded likewise to the spell of the Britanno-Roman life which once surged over his native region, and finds strange magic in the fortified camps, tessellated pavements, fragments of statues and kindred things, which tell of the day when classicism reigned and Latin was the language of the country. A young American poet, Frank Belknap Long, has well summarized this dreamer's rich endowments and wizardry of expression in the sonnet on reading Arthur Machen. There is a glory in the autumn wood, the ancient lanes of England wind and climb. The ancient lanes of England wind and climb, past wizard oaks and gorse and tangled thyme, to where a fort of mighty empire stood. There is a glamour in the autumn sky, the reddened clouds are writhing in the glow of some great fire, and there are glints below of tawny yellow where the embers die. I wait, for he will show me, clear and cold, high raised in splendour sharp against the north, the Roman eagles, and through mists of gold the marching legions as they issue forth. I wait, for I would share with him again the ancient wisdom and the ancient pain. Of Mr. Machen's horror tales the most famous is perhaps The Great God Pan, 1894, which tells of a singular and terrible experiment and its consequences. A young woman, through surgery of the brain cells, is made to see the vast and monstrous deity of nature, and becomes an idiot in consequence, dying less than a year later. Years afterward, a strange, ominous, and foreign-looking child named Helen Vaughan is placed to board with a family in rural Wales, and haunts the woods in unaccountable fashion. A little boy is thrown out of his mind at sight of someone or something he spies with her, and a young girl comes to a terrible end in similar fashion. All this mystery is strangely interwoven with the Roman rural deities of the place, as sculptured in antique fragments. After another lapse of years, a woman of strangely exotic beauty appears in society, drives her husband to horror and death, causes an artist to paint unthinkable paintings of witches' sabbaths, creates an epidemic of suicide among the men of her acquaintance, and is finally discovered to be a frequenter of the lowest dens of vice in London, where even the most callous degenerates are shocked at her enormities. Through the clever comparing of notes on the part of those who have had word of her at various stages of her career, this woman is discovered to be the girl Helen Vaughan, who is the child, by no mortal father, of the young woman on whom the brain experiment was made. She is a daughter of hideous Pan himself, and at the last is put to death amidst horrible transmutations of form, involving changes of sex and a descent to the most primal manifestations of the life principle. But the charm of the tale is in the telling. No one could begin to describe the cumulative suspense and ultimate horror with which every paragraph abounds, without following fully the precise order in which Mr. Machen unfolds his gradual hints and revelations. Melodrama is undeniably present, and coincidence is stretched to a length which appears absurd upon analysis. But in the malign witchery of the tale as a whole, these trifles are forgotten, and the sensitive reader reaches the end with only an appreciative shudder and a tendency to repeat the words of one of the characters. "It is too incredible, too monstrous. Such things can never be in this quiet world. Why, man, if such a case were possible, our earth would be a nightmare." Less famous and less complex in plot than the great god Pan, but definitely finer in atmosphere and general artistic value, is the curious and dimly disquieting chronicle called The White People, whose central portion purports to be the diary or notes of a little girl, whose nurse has introduced her to some of the forbidden magic and soul-blasting traditions of the noxious witch cult. The cult whose whispered lore was handed down long lines of peasantry through Western Europe, and whose members sometimes stole forth at night, one by one, to meet in black woods and lonely places for the revolting orgies of the witches' Sabbath. Mr. Machen's narrative, a triumph of skilful selectiveness and restraint, accumulates enormous power as it flows on in a stream of innocent childish prattle, introducing allusions to strange nymphs, dolls, rulers, white, green, and scarlet ceremonies, Aklo letters, Chian language, Mao games, and the like. The rites learned by the nurse from her witch grandmother are taught to the child by the time she is 3 years old, and her artless accounts of the dangerous secret revelations possess a lurking terror generously mixed with pathos. Evil charms, well known to anthropologists, are described with juvenile naivete, and finally there comes a winter afternoon journey into the old Welsh hills, performed under an imaginative spell which lends to the wild scenery an added weirdness, strangeness, and suggestion of grotesque sentience. The details of this journey are given with marvellous vividness, and form to the keen critic a masterpiece of fantastic writing, with almost unlimited power in the intimation of potent hideousness and cosmic aberration. At length the child, whose age is then 13, comes upon a cryptic and banefully beautiful thing in the midst of a dark and inaccessible wood. In the end, horror overtakes her in a manner deftly prefigured by an anecdote in the prologue, but she poisons herself in time. Like the mother of Helen Vaughan in the great god Pan, she has seen that frightful deity. She is discovered dead in the dark wood beside the cryptic thing she found, and that thing, a whitely luminous statue of Roman workmanship, about which dire medieval rumours had clustered, is affrightedly hammered into dust by the searchers. In the episodic novel of The Three Impostors, a work whose merit as a whole is somewhat marred by an imitation of the jaunty Stevenson manner, occur certain tales which perhaps represent the high-water mark of Machen's skill as a terror weaver. Here we find in its most artistic form a favourite weird conception of the author's: the notion that beneath the mounds and rocks of the wild Welsh hills dwells subterraneously that squat primitive race whose vestiges give rise to our common folk legends of fairies, elves, and the little people, and whose acts are even now responsible for certain unexplained disappearances and occasional substitutions of strange dark changelings for normal infants. This theme receives its finest treatment in the episode entitled The Novel of the Black Seal, where a professor, having discovered a singular identity between certain characters scrawled on Welsh limestone rocks and those existing in a prehistoric black seal from Babylon, sets out on a course of discovery which leads him to unknown and terrible things. A queer passage in the ancient geographer Solinus, a series of mysterious disappearances in the lonely reaches of Wales, a strange idiot son born to a rural mother after a fright in which her inmost faculties were shaken. All these things suggest to the professor a hideous connection and a condition revolting to any friend and respecter of the human race. He hires the idiot boy, who jabbers strangely at times in a repulsive hissing voice, and is subject to odd epileptic seizures. Once, after such a seizure in the professor's study by night, disquieting odours and evidences of unnatural presences are found, and soon after that the professor leaves a bulky document and goes into the weird hills with feverish expectancy and strange terror in his heart. He never returns, but beside a fantastic stone in the wild country are found his watch, money, and ring, done up with catgut in a parchment bearing the same terrible characters as those on the black Babylonish seal and the rock in the Welsh mountains. The bulky document explains enough to bring up the most hideous vistas. Professor Gregg, from the massed evidence presented by the Welsh disappearances, the rock inscription, the accounts of ancient geographers, and the Black Seal, has decided that a frightful race of dark primal beings of immemorial antiquity and wide former diffusion still dwell beneath the hills of unfrequented Wales. Further research has unriddled the message of the Black Seal, and proved that the idiot boy, a son of some father more terrible than mankind, is the heir of monstrous memories and possibilities. That strange night in the study, the professor invoked the awful transmutation of the hills by the aid of the Black Seal, and aroused in the hybrid idiot the horrors of his shocking paternity. He saw his body swell and become distended as a bladder, while the face blackened. And then the supreme effects of the invocation appeared, and Professor Gregg knew the stark frenzy of cosmic panic in its darkest form. He knew the abysmal gulfs of abnormality that he had opened, and went forth into the wild hills, prepared and resigned. He would meet the unthinkable little people, and his document ends with a rational observation: "If unhappily I do not return from my journey, there is no need to conjure up here a picture of the awfulness of my fate." Also in The Three Impostors is the novel of the White Powder, which approaches the absolute culmination of loathsome fright. Francis Lester, a young law student nervously worn out by seclusion and overwork, has a prescription filled by an old apothecary none too careful about the state of his drugs. The substance, it later turns out, is an unusual salt which time and varying temperature have accidentally changed to something very strange and terrible, nothing less, in short, than the medieval vinum sabbati, whose consumption at the horrible orgies of the witches' Sabbath gave rise to shocking transformations and, if injudiciously used, to unutterable consequences. Innocently enough, the youth regularly imbibes the powder in a glass of water after meals, and at first seems substantially benefited. Gradually, however, his improved spirits take the form of dissipation. He is absent from home a great deal, and appears to have undergone a repellent psychological change. One day an odd livid spot appears on his right hand, and he afterward returns to his seclusion, finally keeping himself shut within his room, and admitting none of the household. The doctor calls for an interview, and departs in a palsy of horror, saying that he can do no more in that house. 2 weeks later, the patient's sister, walking outside, sees a monstrous thing at the sick-room window, and servants report that food left at the locked door is no longer touched. Summons at the door brings only a sound of shuffling, and a demand in a thick, gurgling voice to be let alone. At last an awful happening is reported by a shuddering housemaid. The ceiling of the room below Leicester's is stained with a hideous black fluid, and a pool of viscid abomination has dripped to the bed beneath. Dr. Haberden, now persuaded to return to the house, breaks down the young man's door, and strikes again and again with an iron bar at the blasphemous semi-living thing he finds there. It is a dark and putrid mass, seething with corruption and hideous rottenness, neither liquid nor solid, but melting and changing. Burning points like eyes shine out of its midst, and before it is dispatched, it tries to lift what might have been an arm. Soon afterward, the physician, unable to endure the memory of what he has beheld, dies at sea, while bound for a new life in America. Mr. Machen returns to the demoniac Little People in The Red Hand and The Shining Pyramid, and in The Terror, a wartime story, he treats with very potent mystery the effect of man's modern repudiation of spirituality on the beasts of the world, which are thus led to question his supremacy and to unite for his extermination. Of utmost delicacy, and passing from mere horror into true mysticism, is The Great Return, a story of the Grail, also a product of the war period. Too well known to need description here is the tale of The Bowman, which, taken for authentic narration, gave rise to the widespread legend of the Angels of Mons, ghosts of the old English archers of Crécy and Agincourt, who fought in 1914 beside the hard-pressed ranks of England's glorious old contemptibles. Less intense than Mr. Machen in delineating the extremes of stark fear, yet infinitely more closely wedded to the idea of an unreal world constantly pressing upon ours, is the inspired and prolific Algernon Blackwood, amidst whose voluminous and uneven work may be found some of the finest spectral literature of this or any age. Of the quality of Mr. Blackwood's genius there can be no dispute, for no one has even approached the skill, seriousness, and minute fidelity with which he records the overtones of strangeness in ordinary things and experiences, or the preternatural insight with which he builds up detail by detail the complete sensations and perceptions leading from reality into supernormal life or vision. Without notable command of the poetic witchery of mere words, he is the one absolute and unquestioned master of weird atmosphere, and can evoke what amounts almost to a story from a simple fragment of humorless psychological description. Above all others, he understands how fully some sensitive minds dwell forever on the borderland of dream, and how relatively slight is the distinction betwixt those images formed from actual objects, and those excited by the play of the imagination. Mr. Blackwood's lesser work is marred by several defects, such as ethical didacticism, occasional insipid whimsicality, the flatness of benignant supernaturalism, and a too free use of the trade jargon of modern occultism. A fault of his more serious efforts is that diffusiveness and long-windedness which results from an excessively elaborate attempt, under the handicap of a somewhat bold and journalistic style devoid of intrinsic magic, colour, and vitality, to visualize precise sensations and nuances of uncanny suggestion. But in spite of all this, the major products of Mr. Blackwood attain a genuinely classic level, and evoke, as does nothing else in literature, an awed, convinced sense of the immanence of strange spiritual spheres of entities. The well nigh endless array of Mr. Blackwood's fiction includes both novels and shorter tales, the latter sometimes independent and sometimes arrayed in series. Foremost of all must be reckoned The Willows, in which the nameless presences on a desolate Danube island are horribly felt and recognized by a pair of idle voyagers. Here art and restraint in narrative reach their very highest development, and an impression of lasting poignancy is produced without a single strained passage or a single false note. Another amazingly potent, though less artificially finished tale is The Wendigo, where we are confronted by horrible evidences of a vast forest demon about which Northwood's lumbermen whisper at evening. The manner in which certain footprints tell certain unbelievable things is really a marked triumph in craftsmanship. In an episode in a lodging house, we behold frightful presences summoned out of black space by a sorcerer, and the listener tells of the awful psychic residuum creeping about an old house where a leper died,